Hey, welcome to the briefing. What I'm going to cover with you today is this. Everyone smelled it. Nobody could prove who dealt it. As of August 23rd, 2026, there is a dispute playing out inside a mixed-use building in Washington, D.C. that gives us a very clean example of what happens when everybody can see enough evidence to know there is a problem, but nobody yet has enough evidence to prove exactly where that problem is coming from. Residents living above Gordon Ramsay Street Pizza and Street Burger at Terrell Place have reported persistent grease odors and concerns about fine particulate matter inside some condominium spaces. Residents believe restaurant operations are contributing to the condition. The restaurant group and landlord dispute that conclusion. A D.C. Department of Energy and the Environment Inspection did not identify a violation. An engineering assessment commissioned by the Condominium Association later found particulate spikes around noon and again around approximately 5 p.m., and the timing appeared to correlate with restaurant operating activity. But the assessment was not designed to establish the source of those particulates. That last part is the entire episode, because now everybody has evidence, but nobody has source attribution. Those are not the same thing. The engineering firm said more conclusive source determination would require additional sampling involving the restaurant kitchen, exhaust system, and cooking operations. So the evidence had become strong enough to justify concern, strong enough to justify investigation, and strong enough to make the issue difficult to dismiss. It still had not become strong enough to prove the source. And that is where leadership gets interesting, because pressure does not like unresolved variables. Residents want relief, restaurant operators want to know whether their equipment is actually contributing, and property managers and building ownership want to know what needs to change. Everybody has a legitimate reason to want movement. The problem is that movement and correction are not automatically the same thing. That sounds simple when I say it cleanly. But under pressure, leaders start treating the strongest available theory like somebody already proved it. The theory gets promoted to fact before it finishes orientation. That can get expensive very quickly. The restaurant operates during the same periods when particulate readings rise. There is a grease odor, there is restaurant exhaust, and residents are above the restaurant. That creates a plausible theory. Plausible matters. Plausible should affect the investigation. Plausible is not proven. And if I am responsible for the restaurant, the building, or any part of that operation, I cannot pretend the complaints do not exist just because source attribution is unresolved. I also cannot jump from a complaint and a pattern to a technical conclusion I do not actually possess. Those are two different failures, and neither one improves the situation. That is the pressure point. You have enough information to know something deserves attention. You may not have enough information to know what correction deserves action. That distinction is where in-depth analysis begins to matter. Before I go any farther, though, I need to separate in-depth analysis from CSA, because these two can look similar if we get lazy about what information the leader is actually working with. CSA builds the initial responsible read from information already accessible to you. You look at the condition, the people, the environment, the pressure, the available records, what is changing, what is known, what is visible, and what you can reasonably verify without creating an entirely new investigation just to make a routine operating decision. In this case, a restaurant general manager could know when the kitchen is operating, when the hood and exhaust systems are running, whether cleaning requirements are current, and whether maintenance was completed. They could review service calls, complaints that have been forwarded, prior inspections, and whatever normal building or operating information is available to them. That is CSA territory. The manager is not required to become an air quality engineer just to perform the initial read. They are using the information that already exists around the operation to understand what appears to be happening. Now suppose new accessible information appears. Another complaint comes in, a maintenance record becomes available, a building representative provides another observation, or a monitor shows another change. That does not automatically mean you leave CSA. You update the read. Conditions changed. Information became visible, so the assessment changes with it. That is still assessment. In-depth analysis begins somewhere else. It begins when your initial read has done its job well enough to expose a critical variable that you cannot answer from the information you currently possess. That distinction matters because CSA did not somehow fail simply because it could not manufacture evidence that was never available to the leader in the first place. Look at this case. There were complaints, odors, readings, timing information, an inspection, and an engineering assessment. And the operating question still remained unresolved. Where are the particulates actually coming from? At that point, going back through the same maintenance log 5 more times does not necessarily create the missing answer. Looking at another copy of the operating schedule does not create source attribution, and asking everybody what they think does not magically turn opinion into an airflow study. At some point, the maintenance log has been questioned so many times it deserves counsel. You now need something new: sampling, testing, technical expertise, different access, or a deeper examination of the building system, something that was not available inside the original operating read. That is where CSA hands the problem for. The better way to say that is CSA has finished the part of the job it can perform. It did not fail. It brought you far enough to identify exactly where your understanding stopped being sufficient. That distinction matters because if we do not protect it, people start calling every complicated situation in-depth analysis. Then analysis becomes this giant bucket where leaders throw anything they do not immediately understand. That is not the tool. And on the other side, some leaders keep calling everything assessment even after they have exhausted the information available to them. They keep staring at the same facts, hoping the missing answer is eventually going to crawl out of the spreadsheet because everybody has looked at it hard enough. That is not stronger assessment either. That is information recycling. Let's bring this down to the level of a restaurant leader because that is where the decision becomes practical. Imagine you are the general manager of a restaurant operating on the lower level of a mixed-use property. Your dining room is open, the kitchen is running, staff are moving, tickets are coming in, and then you receive another complaint from somebody living above the restaurant. They report a recurring grease odor. Maybe they say it becomes more noticeable during certain operating periods. Building management tells you the complaints appear to line up with lunch or dinner service, or somebody has air monitor readings that appear to rise during those same periods. You should care. That does not mean you should immediately confess to causing something you have not proven. Your first job is to build the read. When are we operating? What equipment is running? Are cleaning and maintenance requirements current? Were there recent repairs? Has anything changed? Have we had similar complaints before? What building system information is available to us? And what do the inspections actually say? That is normal leadership work. You are gathering what you can responsibly access and organizing the operating picture before you choose what happens next. You are not avoiding the problem, and you are not pretending to possess expertise you do not have. Now suppose you do all of that and the picture still does not close. Facility says the restaurant exhaust system appears to be functioning. A resident says the odor is strongest during restaurant operations. A contractor says the system should be separated. And somebody else believes residential airflow may be drawing something into the living space. Everybody has an explanation. The restaurant says building. The building says restaurant. The contractor says it depends. And somewhere above the ceiling, a duct is having the best week of its career. None of that tells you which explanation is right. Pressure is going to try to make somebody choose a villain before the evidence has chosen a source. That is where the general manager needs discipline. A resident may say, shut something down. Ownership may say, fix the exhaust. Facilities may suggest another cleaning, and somebody else may say the restaurant already passed an inspection, so stop treating the restaurant like the problem. Every one of those positions may come from a reasonable place. None of them automatically answers the missing variable. Where is the particulate actually originating, and what system is carrying it into the affected space? If you cannot answer that, the next correction can become a guess, and the more expensive, disruptive, or consequential the correction becomes, the more consequential that guess becomes. That is the part leaders have to respect. Maybe you modify restaurant ventilation. Maybe you alter operating conditions, building management modifies another system, you pay for repeated cleaning, you shut something down, or you tell residents the problem has been corrected, then the odor returns. Now you have spent money, consumed time, created frustration, and made everybody less willing to trust the next explanation. You can clean the flue until it qualifies for a white glove inspection. If the source is somewhere else, congratulations, you now have a very expensive monument to the wrong hypothesis. That is what in-depth analysis is designed to prevent, not action. Wrong action built on an insufficient read. There is an important difference there, and I have learned to respect that difference over time. I have made versions of the mistake where I wanted movement badly enough that the next available answer started looking stronger than the evidence actually supported. The work eventually teaches you that urgency does not improve the quality of a weak assumption. The Washington case already gives us a version of that pressure. According to the reporting, prior response efforts included a deep cleaning of the flue, leak testing, fan function testing, and an engineering review for immediate fire risk. Those actions matter because they show people were not simply ignoring the complaint, but the complaints reportedly continued. Then the later engineering assessment found a timing correlation without establishing source attribution. Now the condition becomes more precise. We know enough to say the issue deserves continued attention. We do not know enough, at least from the publicly available record, to say the restaurant exhaust has been conclusively established as the source. That is a hard place for leaders, because there is a tendency to treat uncertainty as weakness. Somebody wants a yes or no. Is it the restaurant? Is it the building? Is the system safe? Who owns the correction? And what are you going to do? Those are fair questions. Sometimes the correct leadership answer is still, I can tell you what we know, I can tell you what we do not know, and I can tell you what we need to obtain before I am willing to claim the next move is the right one. That is not hiding. That is control. And I think this is where people confuse confidence with decisiveness. A decisive leader is not somebody who always produces an immediate answer. A decisive leader can also say, this variable can break the decision, so I am not going to pretend it has been resolved. That is very different from analysis paralysis. Analysis paralysis is when the team keeps collecting information because making the decision feels uncomfortable. In-depth analysis has a reason to stop. There is a specific missing variable. That variable can change the move, and the team needs something it does not currently possess to resolve it. If you cannot name the missing variable, I would be suspicious that you actually need in-depth analysis. And if the answer to the missing question would not change what you do, I would be even more suspicious because information is not free. It takes time, people, and attention. Sometimes it takes testing, specialists, access, engineering support, legal review, quality support, or money. You do not spend those resources because more data is always better. And we need more data can become one of the cleanest ways to avoid owning a decision. Give it 2 weeks, and it has a calendar invite, 6 stakeholders, and a project code. The decision itself is still sitting outside without a badge. You spend those resources because the missing variable matters enough to the decision that acting without it creates greater risk. That is the threshold. The halt has to be earned. Now take the restaurant example again. Suppose the manager already has an inspection showing a specific exhaust defect, and a qualified technician confirms that defect is allowing discharge into an improper area. You may not need in-depth analysis anymore because you may already know enough to act. Or suppose the issue is simply that the manager lacks authority to approve a building contractor. That sounds more like a manual engagement problem because the missing factor is the right human authority, not deeper analysis. The problem can move if the right person engages. But suppose the building engineer, restaurant facilities lead, and property manager are all present and none of them can establish the source without additional testing. Now bringing in another senior person does not clear the blocker. The right people may already be standing there. The missing understanding is not. That is in-depth analysis. And this is why the separation from manual engagement matters too. Manual engagement says the blocker requires the right person's judgment, authority, skill, trust, relationship, or access. In-depth analysis says even with the right person involved, the present read still does not support responsible action. The technical owner may need testing, engineering may need additional measurements, or facilities may need access to another part of the system. The person is not the missing variable anymore. Understanding is. This is also why the tool sits where it does inside Deepin. Sometimes the operation has already tried the obvious lower risk paths. Maybe you stabilized what you could stabilize, brought in the right person, or redirected something temporarily. Then you hit a point where responsible action requires a deeper read. The problem is no longer willingness, ownership, or simply authority. What we need to understand is the part that matters here is that you do not yet know enough. That is a very specific condition. And we need to keep it specific because there is another trap that shows up constantly in real operations. Correlation starts becoming causation because people are tired of uncertainty. Two things happen at the same time. The restaurant begins lunch service and particulate readings rise. That matters. It should absolutely shape the investigation. It does not automatically tell you the physical pathway, source mechanism, or corrective action. Correlation can earn investigation. It does not automatically earn a conclusion. That line gets crossed faster than people realize. Correlation walks into the meeting as a witness, and 45 minutes later somebody has sentenced it for the crime. Now the correction is being built around a verdict the evidence never actually delivered. And that is not just an air quality lesson. You see the same leadership error everywhere. Sales fall after a schedule change, so the schedule must have caused it. Defects increase after a new operator joins the line, so the operator must be the problem. Patient callbacks rise after a workflow change, so the workflow change must be the cause. A truck leaves late after the carrier arrives, so the carrier must have caused the delay. Maybe. Sometimes the obvious connection is correct, sometimes it is not. The leader's responsibility is not to reject the obvious explanation simply because it is obvious. The responsibility is to make sure the evidence supports the conclusion before that conclusion starts driving accountability and corrective action. CSA helps you read those signals. In-depth analysis becomes relevant when the next action depends on proving something the initial read cannot establish. That difference protects the objective, but it also protects people. Because once leadership decides it knows the cause, accountability starts moving. Somebody gets blamed, somebody gets corrected, somebody gets told to fix their process, money gets assigned, and priorities change. Now people have a personal stake in defending the explanation. The theory gets an email signature and starts assigning accountability. That is how an operating problem becomes a political problem inside an organization. The original question is, where is the source? Then after a few premature corrections, the question quietly changes into, whose fault is this? Those are not the same investigation. The first is trying to understand the condition. The second is trying to allocate responsibility. Justice requires that we get that sequence right. If the restaurant caused it, then deal honestly with that. If a building system caused it, deal honestly with that. If there is an interaction between systems, deal honestly with that. But do not assign responsibility because one explanation is emotionally satisfying, organizationally convenient, or easier to communicate. The standard should follow the evidence. That is the only fair way to connect responsibility to the condition people actually controlled. That is why I like this case for in-depth analysis. There are legitimate complaints, legitimate uncertainty, competing explanations, and evidence that appears to strengthen one theory. There is also an explicit statement from the engineering assessment that it was not designed to establish the source. That is almost a textbook operating boundary. You know enough to know the problem is not imaginary. You do not yet know enough to claim the source is resolved. The gap between those two conditions matters because the correction depends on it. So let me make the CSA distinction as clean as I can. CSA asks, what can I responsibly understand from the information accessible to me now? What do I see? What do I know? What changed? What pressure exists? What constraints exist? And what are the people, systems, records, and operating conditions already showing me? Build the first responsible read. If more accessible information appears, update it. That is the assessment job. In-depth analysis asks something different. What do I now have to what do I need to go get because the current read cannot responsibly support the next move? That might be a test, a system trace, sampling, an engineering analysis, a deeper data set, technical expertise, or access to something the operating leader does not normally possess. That acquisition is the signal. You have crossed from reading what is available into deliberately obtaining what is missing, and the missing thing has to matter. That is why I do not want leaders saying, "We need more data," every time they feel uncertain. Of course you are uncertain. You are a leader. Nobody gives you a binder with every answer already highlighted. Some uncertainty is normal. The question is whether the uncertainty can materially change the move. If it cannot, keep moving. If it can, and the consequence of being wrong is meaningful, then you may have earned the halt. Not because stopping feels safer, but because the missing variable actually controls decision quality. Now look at what happens when that distinction is ignored. First, a complaint appears. Leadership acts on the strongest theory. The correction does not work. Another correction follows. That does not work either. And now people start questioning competence. Residents lose trust, restaurant operators become defensive, property management gets caught in the middle, and contractors start producing competing technical opinions. The cost rises. Everybody has more information, but nobody has more clarity. By the third failed correction, you do not have an investigation anymore. You have a prestige miniseries with no finale and a ventilation budget. Activity multiplies faster than understanding. The better version looks different. The leader takes the complaint seriously, builds the initial read from accessible information, separates confirmed facts from interpretation, and identifies the specific variable preventing a responsible correction. Then they obtain what is necessary to resolve that variable. Not everything that could possibly be known. What matters to the decision. That distinction is important because in-depth analysis is not an open invitation to study forever. You gather what changes the decision. You do not gather information for comfort. And once that variable is sufficiently understood, the operation returns to movement. That last part matters. In-depth analysis has to end. It cannot become an indefinite parking lot for uncomfortable decisions. The purpose of the halt is to improve the next action. The purpose is not to avoid action. That is where the larger direct action system helps. CSA gives the initial read, Deepen helps determine how to navigate the actual problem, and in-depth analysis becomes relevant when the deepened path hits that hard information boundary. From there, pro matters, because waiting has consequences too. Residents may continue experiencing the condition, the restaurant may continue operating under scrutiny, and the building may continue carrying exposure while the investigation continues. So the question is not simply, what happens if we act? It is also, what happens if we do not? TMC matters because the halt has to be communicated clearly. People need to know what is being investigated, what is not being claimed yet, who owns the next step, what work can continue, and what decision is waiting on the missing information. A vague, we are looking into it, is not enough once people are carrying the consequence. The larger system supports the decision. The point here is still in-depth analysis. Do not act confidently from an insufficient read, and do not misunderstand that line. It does not say do not act until every uncertainty disappears. If you wait for perfect certainty in operations, you will spend your career waiting. The standard is sufficient understanding for responsible action. That word sufficient matters. Not perfect, not complete. Sufficient for the decision in front of you. Now bring this back to your own operation. Think about one issue that people have been talking about for a while. Maybe service complaints are increasing, a piece of equipment keeps behaving differently under load, or a customer issue repeats. Maybe one shift consistently performs differently, your inventory record and physical inventory do not reconcile, or a new process seems connected to a new failure pattern. Start with CSA. What information is already available? Have you actually looked at it? Have you talked to the people closest to the work? Have you checked the normal records? Have you compared what the system says against what is physically happening? And have you updated the read as conditions changed? If you have not done that, do not hide behind the words in-depth analysis. You may just need to assess the situation properly. That is not a smaller responsibility. But if you have done that and the next action still depends on a variable you cannot answer, name it. Do not say, we need more data. Say what is missing. What exactly do we not know? Why does it matter? What action could go wrong if that variable is different from what we assume? Would the answer actually change the move? If yes, what do we need to obtain that we do not currently possess? That is the recognition level I want you taking from this episode. I am intentionally not walking you through the full in-depth analysis method here. The structured execution process, how you control the halt, what evidence you pull, how you compare consequence, how you define the condition that ends the halt, and how you transition back into the correct deepen strategy belong inside the training. For now, keep the boundary clean. CSA builds the strongest responsible read from what you can already access. In-depth analysis begins when that read exposes a critical variable the next decision cannot responsibly ignore, and answering it requires you to go obtain something new. That is the difference. And this Washington case makes it unusually visible. Everyone smelled it. Nobody could prove who dealt it. Something happened, everybody has a theory, and somebody's about to get blamed because the room wants an answer faster than the evidence can produce one. At a dinner table, somebody opens a window and everybody moves on. In an operation, somebody signs a purchase order. A complaint is not source attribution. A pattern is not automatically causation. A failed correction does not prove the next theory. An inspection that finds no violation does not necessarily prove there is no operating problem. And an engineering assessment that finds correlation but explicitly does not establish source should not be stretched into certainty because certainty would make the meeting easier. Use the evidence for what the evidence actually supports. No less, no more. That is disciplined leadership. If the information you already possess is enough to support responsible action, move. If the conditions simply changed, update the read. If the missing factor is the right person's authority, judgment, trust, skill, or access, bring in the right person. But when the next action depends on a critical variable that cannot be resolved from the current read, every action has to stop. Well, not every action. The action tied to that missing variable has to stop long enough to obtain what the decision actually requires. Do not freeze everything simply because one part is uncertain. Stop the action that depends on the missing variable. That is in-depth analysis. When you are ready to go deeper with in-depth analysis and the decision execution and problem navigation training path, go to www.direct-action-system.io/course-directory. Use what you have, recognize when it is no longer enough, then go get what the decision actually requires. Thanks for listening to the briefing.